On a rain-soaked afternoon in the English countryside, a proud young prince shattered the only keepsake a village girl possessed, leaving it to vanish in the river's depths. Years passed, seasons turned, lives changed, until fate placed them face to face once more. But now, the same hands that had taken her treasure held it carefully restored, along with a question that could change both their lives forever. The rain had been falling since morning, a steady, unrelenting downpour that dulled the colors of the countryside into shades of gray and brown. Fields lay sodden beneath the weight of the storm, their furrows filling with sluggish water. The narrow lane that wound from the heart of the village to the old stone bridge had turned to a ribbon of mud, its puddles reflecting the heavy, shifting clouds overhead. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke from the cottages huddled along the road, where most had taken shelter from the cold. But she was not indoors. She lingered by the bridge, her skirts clinging to her legs, hem dark with rain and flecked with mud. A trickle of water ran down the side of her neck, following the line of the cord she held in her fingers. The pendant at its end was small and unremarkable to any other eye. A smooth, oval piece of pale river stone worn down by years of touch. She had rubbed it so often that it bore the faint polish of her skin, its edges gentle, its surface warm from being close to her. It was the only thing her mother had left her, the one object that belonged to her alone. She turned it over in her palm now, the rain slipping across it, as though the water might wash away the ache of missing her. A distant rhythm began to break through the hush of falling rain, the muffled thud of hooves on the wet road. She looked up. Through the gauze of rain came a small party of riders, their mounts moving at an easy pace, the horses' coats glistening darkly. The men's cloaks hung heavy and dripping from their shoulders, the water beading on leather boots and polished bridles. At their center rode a young man, the fine cut of his coat, and the faint gleam of gold on his shoulder, marking him as someone far removed from her world. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking his posture, erect, composed, and steeped in the kind of authority that belonged to those who had never been told no. They drew closer, the splash of hooves breaking the stillness around her. The young man's gaze found her and held it, his expression neither curious nor kind, but faintly disdainful, as though she were no more than a stray branch in his path. His horse's breath steamed in the cool air, the animal's dark mane slicked to its neck. She remained where she was, her hand tightening protectively around the pendant. When they reached the bridge, he pulled on the reins. The others slowed, waiting without question as he swung down from his saddle. The mud sucked faintly at his boots as he stepped toward her, rain streaking his dark hair beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes flicked to the cord at her throat, and a faint curl touched his mouth, something between a smirk and a sneer. Before she could move, his gloved hand reached out and closed around the pendant. There was no hesitation, no pretense of asking. His fingers tugged once, sharply, and the cord gave way with a faint snap. The sudden emptiness at her throat was as startling as the act itself. The stone lay in his palm for the space of a breath before he let it fall. It struck the edge of a puddle and rolled into the muddied water at their feet, vanishing beneath the ripples. The sound it made was almost delicate, absurdly small for something that had been everything to her. She stared at the spot where it had disappeared, her breath shallow, the rain blurring her sight until she could not tell if it was water or tears that burned her eyes. He turned away without another glance, his long strides carrying him back to the waiting horse. In one smooth motion, he swung into the saddle, the leather creaking softly under his weight. A touch of his heel, and the animal moved forward, the others falling into formation behind him. The steady splash of hooves on wet stone faded slowly down the lane, mingling with the rain until the sound was gone. She did not watch them leave. Her knees struck the soft earth as she crouched, hands diving into the puddle, fingers combing blindly through the cold, murky water. Her pulse hammered in her ears, her breath quick and shallow as she searched. Mud swirled under her touch, pebbles shifting beneath her fingertips. She found nothing. Her hands moved faster, scooping, probing, the water numbing her skin until she could barely feel. The rain had already filled the hollow at the edge of the road, its surface dancing with ripples, and every movement of her hands only clouded it further. She pushed her wet hair back from her face and leaned closer, squinting against the shifting reflections. Somewhere beneath that churned water was the one thing she could not lose. And then she saw it. A pale gleam caught in the silt, no bigger than a coin, a ghost of what had been hers. Her heart gave a painful jolt as she reached for it, the tips of her fingers brushing the smooth surface. The current from the overflowing ditch tugged at it, pulling it sideways, almost imperceptibly. She pressed her hand down harder, curling her fingers around it, feeling the familiar curve. Relief flared so suddenly it made her dizzy. But the rain-swollen water had its own will. In the instant before her grip could tighten, the current wrenched the pendant away, slipping it between her fingers like a living thing. She gasped, plunging both hands in after it, but the movement only sent up another cloud of silt, erasing the pale shimmer from view. The water swallowed it entirely, sweeping it under the lip of the bridge and into the dark, restless current beyond. The cold pressed against her, like a living thing, seeping through the soaked wool of her dress and the thin skin of her fingers as she knelt in the mud. The water beyond the bridge mouth was swollen, restless, dragging at everything it touched. She pushed herself lower, the wet earth sucking at her knees, her hands plunging again into the stream's shallows. The shock of the cold bit into her joints, making her clench her teeth, but she did not pause. She scoured blindly along the riverbed, feeling for the familiar smoothness, the gentle oval curve that belonged to her alone. The stream ran fast, carrying twigs and sodden leaves past her hands. With each movement, the silt clouded thick and brown, blinding her from even the faintest glimpse of the pendant. She worked by touch, fingertips combing through a layer of small stones and gritty sand. The ache in her shoulders deepened, but she pushed forward, driven by something fierce and unwilling to yield. The rain had lost its earlier fury, but still fell steadily, the drops hissing where they struck the water. Farther down the lane, the voices of villages rose and faded again, indistinct over the rush of the current. None came close. The air was filled with the mingled scents of wet moss, riverweed, and the raw earth the storm had laid bare. Her breathing was shallow and quick, each exhale misting faintly in the cold. She shifted along the bank, following the arc of the current beneath the bridge. The space there was shadowed, the stone arch darkened by age and damp, its underside slick with moss. She leaned forward, peering into the gloom, her eyes adjusting to catch the faint play of light on the water's surface. Somewhere in that darkness, the pendant might still lie waiting. A sudden glint caught her eye, small, pale, unmistakable. It lay wedged between two submerged roots where the current curled around them, the shape blurred by the water's shifting surface. Her heart gave a quick, sharp beat, and she moved without hesitation, lowering herself onto her elbows at the edge of the bank. The muddy water soaked the bodice of her dress as she reached down, stretching until her shoulder brushed the surface. The cold was merciless, a biting ache that crawled up her arm. Her fingers closed around the pendant, and for a breathless moment she had it, the familiar weight pressing into her palm. She tried to draw it upward, but the frayed cord had tangled in the roots, holding it fast. Her grip tightened, the tendons in her wrist straining as she pulled. The roots shifted slightly but would not release their hold. The water surged, lifting her hair into damp strands that clung to her cheeks. She adjusted her angle, bracing one hand on the bank while tugging harder with the other. For a heartbeat, the cord began to give, and then, without warning, the stone slipped free of her fingers entirely. The current seized it instantly, sweeping it out from the roots with a flash of pale color before spinning it into deeper water. A small sound escaped her, half gasp, half cry. She lunged forward after it, her palm slicing through the cold in vain. The pendant drifted into the center of the stream, bobbing for an instant before the force of the swollen current pulled it swiftly downstream. She scrambled to her feet, the mud clinging heavily to her skirts, and stumbled along the bank. The swollen stream had grown impatient, carrying the pendant toward the place where the water narrowed and rushed toward the old weir. The white froth beyond the stone drop was visible even from here, the low roar of it growing louder with every step. Her boots slipped in the muck, splashing through shallow pools. The hem of her dress dragged behind her like a weight, but she kept going, her eyes locked on the flash of pale stone ahead. The banks here were more treacherous, the rain having loosened the soil. She caught herself once, twice, her heart jolting each time her foot slid toward the water. Her breath came fast, her pulse quick with the fear of losing the pendant entirely. The roar of the weir grew until it filled her ears, drowning out all other sound. She could see the stone now and then in the racing water, tumbling end over end like something desperate to escape her grasp. She ran harder, following the bend in the bank. A tangle of reeds brushed her ankles, their leaves slick and cold. The air was heavy with the smell of churned water and sodden wood, the spray from the weir lifting faintly into the air and mingling with the mist. She could just make out the place where the stream split around a jagged rock before plunging over the drop. And there, caught for the briefest of moments, was the pendant. Her chest tightened. She slid down the last stretch of bank, her hands gripping the branches that hung low over the water. The wood was wet and slick, the bark flaking beneath her nails. But she clung to it, leaning out as far as she dared. The pendant spun lazily in a small eddy, just inches from the pull of the fall. The spray cooled her face, carrying the scent of minerals and moss. The current tugged harder, lifting the pendant toward the edge. She reached, fingers spread wide, the cold biting into her skin. For an instant, she felt the smoothness beneath her fingertips, the familiar curve against her skin, and hope flared sharp and bright. Then the water surged, and the pendant slipped away, darting toward the foaming lip of the weir. The roar of the weir swallowed the sound of her breathing. White water poured in an unbroken sheet over the stone lip, the churning below flecked with foam and shadows. She edged closer, her boots sliding on the slick, moss-darkened stones of the bank. The pendant was still visible, caught for the briefest of moments in a swirl of current above the drop. It spun once, twice, the pale surface flashing in the dim light. She crouched low, one hand braced on a wet rock, the other stretching out toward the glimmer. Her fingertips skimmed the water, feeling the icy bite, the pull of the river urging her closer. A shiver passed through her from the cold, but she leaned farther, unwilling to lose what she had already come so far to reclaim. The air was thick with mist from the fall, dampening her hair until it clung in dark strands across her cheeks. The smell of the river filled her lungs, sharp and mineral, laced with the faint decay of sodden leaves. Her heartbeat thundered against her ribs, almost matching the pounding of the water against the rocks below. For a moment, the pendant bobbed near the jagged outcrop at the center of the weir, as though the river itself hesitated to let it go. She moved her hand closer, the cold climbing past her wrist now, her arm trembling from the effort of holding herself steady. The stones beneath her boots shifted slightly, a warning she ignored. Her fingertips touched the smooth edge of the stone, there, just there, and hope surged, fierce and bright. She closed her fingers around it, the familiar curve slipping into her palm like a long-lost heartbeat. But even as she felt its weight, the river wrenched against her grip. The cord snagged for an instant on the rough rock, then snapped free, the sudden release nearly pitching her forward. The force of the current tore the pendant from her grasp before she could close her fist. She saw it vanish over the lip of the weir, disappearing into the churning froth below. The sound of it being swallowed was lost to the relentless crash of water. Her breath came sharp and fast, her chest aching with the effort. She shifted her weight, searching for another path down to the pool where the river gathered after its plunge. The spray stung her skin, turning her lashes wet and heavy. She scanned the water, looking for the briefest flicker of pale color among the restless foam. The banks on either side of the weir were slick and steep, the grass worn away to reveal dark, slippery mud. She moved along the edge, crouching low, one hand pressed to the ground for balance. Her eyes stayed fixed on the pool below, where the water boiled and swirled before smoothing into the slower current farther downstream. The pendant was nowhere to be seen. Only the restless white churn met her gaze, disguising anything caught within its depths. Her teeth pressed hard together, the cold in her bones now matched by a growing heaviness in her chest. A faint shape stirred below the surface, just a suggestion. A pale blur swept toward the outer edge of the pool. She took a step closer, the stone beneath her feet slick as glass. Her hand shot out toward an overhanging branch, the bark damp and rough under her fingers, but she was already leaning dangerously far over the drop. The water's voice was a constant in her ears now, drowning all thought. The pendant drifted nearer to where the current spilled into the calmer water beyond, but it remained just beyond reach. She crouched lower, stretching herself over the edge. Her boots slipped. In an instant, the ground beneath her seemed to vanish, the slick stone offering no hold. The branch wrenched from her grasp, bark tearing against her palm. Her arms flailed for balance, but the pull of the river was already claiming her. Cold slammed into her like a fist, knocking the breath from her lungs as she plunged into the pool below. The world became a blur of soundless green-brown water, spinning her until she could not tell which way was up. The weight of her soaked skirts dragged her downward, tangling about her legs. Her eyes stung. Her chest screamed for air, but her limbs moved without thought, clawing toward where she hoped the surface lay. She broke through with a ragged gasp, the misted air as shocking as the cold. The roar of the weir crashed back into her ears, louder than ever. She kicked hard, fighting to keep her head above the surface, but the current seized her again, dragging her toward the outer edge of the pool where the river gathered speed. Spray blinded her. Her arms ached from the effort, and the sodden fabric clung to her like lead. Each breath felt stolen, the cold seeping deeper with every second. Somewhere on the bank, a shadow moved against the grayness of the rain, too far away to be more than a blur. The water pulled her faster toward the racing stream below, the force unrelenting, her strength ebbing with every stroke. The cold gripped her like a living creature, winding itself around her ribs and stealing the air from her lungs. Each breath was shallow and ragged, her chest burning with the strain of keeping above the water. The river spun her, first one way, then the other, the current pulling at her limbs with an implacable strength. Her skirts, heavy as sodden wool blankets, tangled about her legs and dragged her down with every kick. She gasped and coughed, the taste of the river sharp on her tongue. Her eyes stung from the spray as she fought to find a rhythm, to angle herself toward the bank. The sound of the weir roared in her ears, close enough that its mist still clung to her skin. All around her, the water churned and shifted, tugging her in directions she could not predict. The cold seemed to have reached her very bones, slowing her muscles, making her movements sluggish. Through the haze of water and mist, something struck against her shoulder. A hand, gripping hard. The shock of it jolted her out of the spinning panic, and she turned her head enough to see the blurred outline of a man's face, wet hair plastered to his forehead, his jaw set in grim determination. His clothes clung to him, heavy with the river, and his arm locked around hers with unyielding strength. He hauled her toward the bank, his body cutting through the current with practiced efficiency. She could feel the pull of his strokes, the steady, powerful kicks beneath the surface. She tried to help, but her legs felt unresponsive, as though the river had claimed them. The sound of the water was deafening, broken only by her own labored breathing and the low grunt of effort from the man dragging her along. The bank loomed nearer, a steep, muddy rise slick with rain and river spray. He shoved her upward ahead of him, his hands firm beneath her arms. Her palms slipped against the wet earth as she tried to find purchase, clumps of mud giving way under her weight. He pushed harder, and with one final heave, she was sprawled on the grass above the waterline, her lungs heaving as she gulped in the damp air. The grass was cold against her cheek, flattened by the rain, and each breath seared her chest. She coughed, spitting out river water, her whole body shaking from the shock. Her hair lay plastered to her skin, dripping in slow, cold rivulets down her neck. She closed her eyes for a moment, the scent of wet soil and crushed greenery filling her senses. The man climbed up beside her, his breathing heavy but controlled. Droplets rolled off his sleeves as he crouched, scanning her face as if to assure himself she was still aware. Beyond him, the river surged on, untroubled by what it had taken or spared. She turned her head toward the water, instinctively searching for the pale flicker of her pendant. There was nothing. Only the restless roll of the current, as though it had swallowed her treasure whole and buried it in its depths. A hollow ache settled in her chest, deep and final. The man followed her gaze for a moment, then looked back at her, his mouth set in a thin line. His eyes held no false hope, and he said nothing. Around them, the rain had softened to a fine mist, but the chill remained, clinging to the air and to her skin. The sound of the river filled the silence between them, steady and indifferent. She tried to push herself upright, her muscles protesting, but he steadied her with one hand against her shoulder. Her breaths came slower now, though her heart still pounded in her ears. The damp grass bent beneath her palms, releasing the clean scent of rain and earth. And then, from somewhere beyond the bridge, came the faint but unmistakable rhythm of hooves on wet ground. The sound grew clearer, each measured beat carrying through the softened rain. She lifted her head, her gaze drawn toward the shadowed shape emerging from the far side of the crossing. Through the thinning mist, a mounted figure came into view, tall in the saddle, the horse's dark coat shining with moisture. The rider slowed, the gleam of fine leather tack catching what little light pierced the clouds. The animal's breath misted in the air, its head tossing slightly as it stepped onto the grass. The man's posture was upright and certain, his gaze fixed directly on her where she sat shivering on the bank. There was no mistaking him. The prince guided his horse closer, the animal's hooves pressing deep into the softened grass with a dull, wet sound. The rain clung to the black leather of the saddle, beading on the polished brass fittings before running down in thin rivulets. His coat was dark from the weather, the heavy fabric molding to the lines of his shoulders. The plume of the horse's breath curled in the cool air, each exhale a white drift that dissolved into the mist. The man who had pulled her from the water shifted his stance, moving slightly to stand between her and the approaching rider. His boots sank into the sodden ground, but he held himself firmly, his gaze fixed on the prince without a word. The girl, still seated on the grass, drew her knees up and wrapped her arms tightly around them, her body trembling in small, uneven shivers. The distance between the prince and the bank narrowed. The steady rhythm of the horse's breathing mingled with the softer hiss of the rain and the constant rush of the river behind her. His eyes, dark beneath the shadow of his hat, swept over her, taking in the mud-streaked hem of her skirt, the dripping hair that clung to her cheeks, the pale tension in her lips. There was no trace of the mocking curve she remembered from the bridge. When he reached the edge of the bank, he drew the reins and dismounted with deliberate slowness. His boots sank into the wet turf, leaving clear impressions as he crossed the short space toward her. The rescuer's shoulders squared, ready to bar his way, but the prince halted just short of him. Rain traced a line along the brim of his hat before slipping down the side of his face. For a moment, the three of them stood in stillness, the only sound the water rushing over the weir. The prince's gaze shifted briefly to the river before returning to her. His expression was unreadable, save for a faint tightness around the mouth, as if he weighed something in silence. Then, without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. The movement was unhurried, almost cautious, his gloved fingers drawing out a small object wrapped in a strip of dark, damp cloth. Droplets clung to the fabric, sliding down and soaking into the leather of his gloves. Her breath caught. The shape was irregular, small enough to fit in his palm. He held it loosely at first, as if the weight of it was nothing, yet his hand did not lower. The rescuer glanced from the cloth to the prince's face, his own expression guarded. The prince shifted his grip, holding the bundle out toward her. The rain pattered softly on the grass, on the surface of the river, on the brim of his hat. She stared at the object, her pulse quickening despite the chill in her veins. Her arms tightened around her knees, not from cold this time, but from the strange pull of uncertainty. He stood motionless, the strip of cloth resting against the curve of his palm, the distance between them holding like a taut thread. The rescuer remained silent, but his stance had changed, his weight balanced as though ready to intervene. The sound of the river seemed louder now, a low, ceaseless murmur behind the tension of the moment. The prince's eyes met hers, steady and dark, offering no hint of his intent. Then, slowly, he extended his hand farther, closing the space by a single step. The cloth dangled slightly from his fingers, the damp edges fluttering with the faint movement of the air. From somewhere beyond the lane came the distant thud of hooves, faint at first, then clearer, the rhythm quickening as it approached. The prince's head turned slightly toward the sound, though his arm remained extended toward her. The rescuer's gaze shifted as well, tracking the direction of the noise. Through the curtain of rain, another figure emerged on horseback, the rider urging the animal forward at a brisk pace. The crest on his livery caught a muted glimmer of light, unmistakable in its royal mark. His face was set in urgency, his posture low over the saddle as he guided the horse onto the soft ground. The prince did not lower his arm, but his eyes moved to the oncoming rider, his jaw tightening by a fraction. The damp cloth in his hand grew heavier with rain, the outline of the object within faintly visible through the fabric. The air felt colder somehow, sharper, as the second rider drew nearer. The horse came to a halt a few paces away, its sides heaving, nostrils flaring as it tossed its head. The man in royal livery swung down without ceremony, boots striking the ground with a muted thud. His gaze went directly to the prince, ignoring both her and her rescuer. In his gloved hand was a sealed note, the wax dark and unbroken despite the rain. He crossed the short space between them and extended it toward the prince. The prince took the folded note from the messenger's hand, the rain sliding down the sealed wax before his thumb broke it with a clean, deliberate motion. The sound of tearing paper was small against the low rush of the river. He unfolded the sheet, his eyes scanning the lines quickly, each word drawing a sharper edge to the set of his jaw. The messenger stood at attention, his breath still fast from the ride, drops of water clinging to the brim of his hat and the fine stitching of his gloves. His horse shifted restlessly behind him, steam curling from its flanks in the cool, wet air. The rescuer remained in place, his body angled just enough to keep a clear view of both the prince and the girl, though his weight had shifted, ready for whatever might follow. The girl's eyes flicked from the prince's face to the damp bundle still in his other hand. Her chest rose and fell with slow, uneven breaths, the cold a constant ache in her bones. Yet there was a sharper awareness now, a taut thread pulling her toward the small object he carried. She could not guess what words the note held, but she could see the way they pressed on him, the way his gaze narrowed slightly as though measuring the ground ahead. When he finished, he folded the paper once more and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, his movements quick and precise. He did not hand the bundle to her, though it still rested in his palm, the cloth darkened with rain, clinging to the shape within. His eyes returned to hers for a moment, steady and searching, before shifting to the messenger. The horse behind them let out a sharp snort, pawing at the soft earth. A faint gust of wind curled along the riverbank, lifting strands of her wet hair against her cheek. The mist rising from the weir caught the wind as well, drifting between them in pale veils before breaking apart. The prince's posture held stillness, but it was the kind that preceded motion. His gaze dropped briefly to the river, as if marking its course, then came back to her. He stepped closer, the lines of his coat brushing against his thigh as he moved. She thought for an instant that he might place the bundle in her hands, but as the space closed between them, his arm lowered, and instead of offering it, he drew it back to his chest. Her heart thudded once, hard in her ribs. The motion was subtle, but it cut through the moment, like a thin blade. The rain thickened for a span of heartbeats, a sudden, heavier curtain between them, pattering against the bank and the surface of the water, until it eased again to its former steady rhythm. The messenger cleared his throat quietly, a sound almost lost beneath the river's voice, and inclined his head toward the waiting horse. The prince did not move immediately, though his eyes had lost none of their focus. A breath of tension seemed to pass between the two men, one taut with expectation, the other weighted with choice. He glanced at her again, the look holding for the space of a breath. Then, with a smooth motion, he tucked the bundle into the inner fold of his coat, the fabric closing over it as though sealing it away. The absence in her sight was sharper than she would have expected, as if something essential had been taken twice. The prince turned toward his horse, the sodden grass bending under his steps. The messenger followed a pace behind, boots pressing into the softened ground with muted thuds. Water dripped steadily from the brim of the prince's hat, tracing the line of his cheek before falling to the earth. He gathered the reins, his gloved fingers curling around the worn leather, and placed one boot in the stirrup. For a moment he paused, the reins slack, his profile still as the wind caught the edge of his coat. Then he swung into the saddle, the movement fluid despite the heaviness of his soaked clothing. The messenger mounted as well, and together they turned toward the lane that led away from the bridge and the bank. The girl remained seated in the wet grass, her arms still wrapped around herself, watching the space between them lengthen. The rescuer stood nearby, silent, his gaze fixed on the departing figures. The sound of hooves on the soft ground faded slowly, replaced again by the constant murmur of the river and the soft patter of rain on the leaves overhead. The prince did not look back. The shape of the bundle was gone from sight, but its absence left the air heavier, as though the moment itself had weight. She felt it pressing in, sharp and unyielding, as the two riders reached the crest of the lane and began to disappear into the mist. The space they left behind was filled only with the lingering imprint of their passing. The marks of hooves in the softened ground, the faint trace of leather and horse on the damp air. And beneath it all, the sound of the river, steady and unchanging, carried onward through the rain. The lane was empty again, save for the soft indentations of hooves in the mud and the faint tremor of disturbed air where the riders had passed. The girl sat motionless in the grass, the damp seeping through every layer of her clothing. The chill had settled into her bones, but it was not the cold that pressed most heavily. It was the hollow, unnameable feeling left in the wake of the prince's departure. The place where the bundle had been, so close to her reach, seemed almost a physical absence, as if it had been plucked from her not once, but twice. The man who had pulled her from the river shifted beside her. His boots squelched faintly in the sodden ground as he crouched to offer a hand. She took it, her fingers cold and stiff, allowing him to help her to her feet. The wet grass bent beneath their weight, releasing a fresh scent of rain-soaked earth. Her limbs felt heavy, but she steadied herself, her gaze drifting inevitably to the bend of the lane where the prince had vanished into the mist. The rain had thinned to a fragile drizzle, a gauze of silver threads barely dimming the gray light. The river ran on at her back, its voice constant, indifferent to the moment that had just passed. She turned to look at it once more, as if the pendant might yet surface against all reason. Only the restless surface answered her, carrying twigs and pale leaves downstream without pause. The rescuer spoke no words as he guided her away from the bank toward the shelter of the village road. Mud clung to her boots, each step heavier than the last. The cottages ahead were blurred shapes against the haze, their chimneys trailing ribbons of pale smoke into the low sky. The faint smell of burning peat and damp wood drifted on the air, mingling with the sharper scent of wet foliage from the hedgerows. They passed through the narrow street, the sound of their footfalls softened by the wet ground. A few figures stood in doorways, cloaks drawn close, eyes following her without remark. She felt the weight of their curiosity but kept her gaze lowered, aware of the mud streaked along her skirt and the tangled strands of hair against her face. The rescuer's hand lingered lightly at her elbow, steadying her as they crossed a stretch of uneven cobble slick with rain. By the time they reached the small yard beside her home, the drizzle had eased into a fine mist that clung to her lashes. She paused at the threshold, her breath clouding faintly in the cooling air. The rescuer released her arm, giving a brief nod before turning back toward the lane, his figure soon swallowed by the damp gray distance. She stepped inside, the dimness of the room wrapping around her. The scent of damp wool rose from her clothing as she moved toward the small hearth, though no fire yet burned there. Her hands shook slightly as she unpinned her wet hair, the strands falling heavy around her shoulders. In the stillness, she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, and beyond the walls, the softened rush of the river. The hours that followed unfolded with the slow inevitability of rain sliding down glass. She tended to small tasks, removing her boots, wringing out the hem of her skirt, setting a kettle to heat. But her thoughts circled back again and again to the prince's face, the feel of his gaze as he had stood before her. The memory of the bundle in his hand was sharp enough to make her chest ache. The light outside dimmed, shadows lengthening along the floorboards. The rain ceased at last, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rolled over the uneven road, its wheels splashing through lingering puddles. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening, but no hoofbeats followed. Days passed in the same measured rhythm. The river ran clear again, its banks soft with new grass where the floods had receded. The memory of that afternoon did not dull, though it settled into her as quietly as the mist that gathered each morning along the fields. The pendant was gone. The prince was gone. Life narrowed again to its familiar boundaries, the chores that marked each day, the quiet hours between them, the slow turning of seasons. Spring gave way to summer, then autumn. The leaves turned and fell, swept into small drifts along the lanes. Frost came to the fields in white, crystalline patterns, and the river's surface grew sluggish with cold. The cottages of the village stood in their same quiet row, windows glowing with candlelight in the early dark. She moved among them as she always had, her steps steady, her head bowed against the wind. Years layered themselves one upon another without fanfare. Faces in the village changed, children grew into youth, elders passed into memory, but the pattern of days endured. She did not see the prince again, nor hear more than the rare mention of his name in the tavern or on the lips of travelers. When she thought of him, it was always as he had stood on the bank that day, rain shining on the leather of his gloves, the bundle in his hand and something unspoken in his eyes. Late one autumn afternoon, as the light thinned and the air sharpened with the promise of frost, she walked along the lane toward the village square. The ground was soft with recent rain, and the wind stirred the last of the withered leaves across her path. The sound of harness leather creaking reached her before she saw the riders. A small party emerged from the curve of the road, their horses stepping carefully over the slick ground. At their front rode a man she recognized instantly, though the years had sharpened his features and deepened the shadows in his eyes. His coat was of fine cut, though travel-worn, and his posture in the saddle was as upright and sure as she remembered. He reined his horse as his gaze found hers. The clatter of hooves slowed as the riders entered the square, their arrival drawing glances from those lingering near shop fronts and cottage doors. The smell of damp wool and leather drifted in with them, mingling with the faint smoky scent of hearth fires burning against the chill. The prince dismounted in one smooth movement, the long fall of his coat settling heavily around his legs. Mud clung to the edges of his boots, and his gloves bore the fine spray of recent rain. He handed his reins to a groom who had stepped forward from the party, then crossed the uneven cobbles toward her. The sound of his footsteps carried even over the creak of saddles and the shifting of horses. His gaze did not waver, the dark intensity of it holding her still where she stood. The years had added lines at the corners of his eyes, a faint sternness to the set of his mouth, yet there was something quieter beneath it, less the sharp pride she remembered, more a weight that had settled deep in him. The air between them seemed to draw taut as he came to a halt a few paces away. The square was quieter now, voices dropping as onlookers turned their attention toward the pair. The wind stirred, lifting the edge of her shawl and carrying with it the crisp scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. She stood rooted to the worn stones, every detail of the moment fixed in her awareness. The hollow thud of his boots, the rise and fall of his breath, the faint gleam of rain still clinging to his hair. His eyes traveled over her face, pausing briefly at the curve of her mouth before returning to meet her gaze. There was no hurry in his movements. He reached into the satchel slung across his shoulder, his hand disappearing into its depth. When it emerged, it held a small wooden box, its polished surface dulled by the softness of the day's light. The brass clasp at its front was tarnished to a warm, muted gold, worn smooth in places from handling. He held the box in both hands, as though its contents were of a weight beyond measure. The scent of oiled wood reached her faintly as he stepped closer and extended it toward her. She did not move at first, the sight of it drawing a stillness through her that was almost breathless. Slowly she raised her hands, the cool air brushing her wrists as her fingers closed around the box. The wood was warm from his touch. The clasp yielded easily beneath her thumb, and the lid lifted without sound. Inside, resting against a lining of dark velvet, lay the pendant. The stone had been smoothed and set into a delicate silver frame, the soft gleam of the metal catching the muted daylight. The cord was new, strong and even, yet the shape of the stone remained unchanged, familiar in every curve and hollow, as if the years had never passed. A faint rush of air escaped her lungs, the kind that comes when something long lost is found in the waking world instead of in memory. The silver setting was simple, but the craftsmanship spoke of patient care, of hands that had taken time to preserve what might easily have been discarded. Her fingers hovered above the stone, not yet touching it, as if to do so might break some fragile thread. The prince watched her without speaking, his hands now at his sides, his posture steady, but not unyielding. Around them, the square carried on in muted fashion, the creak of a wagon wheel, the muffled call of a vendor, but none approached. The moment seemed set apart, the air holding an almost tangible quiet between the two of them. She closed the box gently, the clasp settling into place with a soft click. Her hands did not immediately lower, and when she looked up at him again, her gaze was steady, though the questions that rose in her could find no voice. The weight of the box was slight, yet it filled her arms as if it were the sum of all the years that had passed. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the faint scent of the river from beyond the village. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The prince's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his stance, as though he had reached the limit of some inward patience. A droplet of water slid from the corner of the box onto her palm, trailing cool against her skin before falling to the stones at their feet. The simple sound of it striking the ground seemed loud in the stillness. She kept her gaze on him, the faintest tightening in her chest matching the pull of the moment. And then, without a word, he inclined his head slightly, as if to acknowledge something unspoken, and gestured toward the lane leading away from the square. He moved with unhurried steps, his boots making a muted rhythm against the worn stones of the square. She followed beside him, the small wooden box cradled in both hands, the smooth grain warm from her touch. The faint creak of leather came with each movement of his coat, and the cool air carried the quiet mingling scents of rain-damp earth and wood smoke. The square gradually gave way to the narrow lane, its edges lined with low stone walls darkened by years of weather. Patches of moss clung to the crevices, and thin weeds grew where the stones had shifted. The ground was soft from the previous day's rain, their steps sinking slightly with each pace. Overhead, the clouds were pale and low, the light diffused into a steady glow that blurred the edges of the landscape. They walked without speaking. The only sounds were the soft rustle of her skirts, the scuff of his heels, and the muted call of a rook circling above the bare branches of a tree by the river. The stillness between them was not heavy, only deliberate, as if each was measuring the space that time had carved. After a short distance, the lane curved toward a low rise, and from its crest, the river came into view. The water was calm now, its surface smooth, save for the gentle ripples stirred by the wind. The air here was sharper, carrying the clean scent of the current. The banks were edged in pale grass, brittle beneath the season's chill, and the old bridge arched ahead, its stones dark with age and damp. He slowed as they neared it, his gaze fixed on the structure. She glanced toward the bridge as well, its surface glistening faintly in the muted light. The last time she had stood here, the air had been thick with rain, and the river had roared in flood. Now the scene lay in quiet contrast, the water slipping beneath the arch with a steady, low murmur. They reached the center and stopped. The worn stones beneath their feet were cool, slick in places where moss had grown in the shallow dips. She rested the box lightly against her chest, feeling the faint thud of her heartbeat through it. The wind passed along the length of the bridge, tugging at the ends of her hair and the edge of his coat. He turned toward her then, his posture eased but his gaze intent. For a moment, neither moved. The hush of the river below and the far-off rustle of dry reeds along the bank seemed to fold the space around them into a smaller, more private world. With deliberate care, he reached for the box in her hands. She let him take it, her fingers brushing against his gloves in the exchange. He opened it, the brass clasp giving a small click, and lifted the pendant from its place. The silver setting caught the pale light, a subdued gleam tracing its curves. He stepped closer, raising the pendant so the new cord brushed against the back of his fingers. The scent of the river was stronger here, mingled with the faint tang of damp stone. His hands moved with measured steadiness as he fastened the cord at the nape of her neck, the touch brief but certain. The stone settled against her collarbone, its weight familiar yet altered, as though it carried both the years lost and those still to come. When he stepped back, his eyes lingered on the pendant before returning to hers. The wind pressed gently against them, carrying a quiet that seemed to invite words, though none came immediately. She touched the stone lightly with her fingertips, feeling its cool surface warm slowly against her skin. From the edge of the bridge, the river's muted reflection held them in its frame, two figures standing still in the pale light. The air between them carried no urgency now, only the faint, unspoken acknowledgement of what had passed and what remained. He reached into his coat once more, this time withdrawing a small, velvet-covered case. Its dark surface was plain, the fabric dulled by handling. He held it in one hand, his thumb resting lightly on the edge of the lid, but he did not yet open it. The quiet deepened, filled only by the sigh of the wind along the water, and the muted clink of the case as it shifted slightly in his grip. She looked from his hand to his face, the stillness in her breath matched by the steady calm of his gaze. There was no haste in him, but something in the way he stood told her this moment had been long in reaching. The river flowed beneath them, carrying its own rhythm forward, steady and unbroken. The wind moved gently across the bridge, stirring a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. She lifted her hand to smooth it back, her fingers brushing the cool edge of the pendant where it rested against her collarbone. Its weight felt right there, anchored, familiar, yet new, as if it had returned to her changed by all it had endured. The prince's gaze remained on her, steady and unflinching, as though the quiet between them were as important as any words he might offer. In his hand, the small velvet case rested, the dark fabric absorbing the pale light. His thumb traced the edge of the lid once before he opened it with a subtle motion. Inside lay a ring, its silver band smooth and unadorned, save for the single clear stone set in its center. The gem caught the light with a soft brilliance, refracting glimmers of pale fire. There was nothing ostentatious about it, no flourish, no excessive design, yet it carried a quiet elegance that seemed deliberate, as though chosen to match not only the pendant, but the woman who now wore it. He stepped closer, the faint sound of his boots against the stone marking the small distance closed between them. The air around them was cool, tinged with the scent of the river and the dry sweetness of fallen leaves along its bank. She felt the change in his presence as he drew near, the sense of him settling over the space between them like a steady, unbroken line. For a moment, he did not move further, only holding the open case so that the ring caught the soft light. Her eyes met his, and the years between then and now seemed to fold in on themselves. The cold rain on the lane, the rush of the flooded river, the hollow ache of loss, and the long, unspoken absence. He took the ring from its place, the metal glinting faintly between his fingers. His other hand lifted slightly, palm up, a quiet invitation. The sound of the river below filled the pause, its steady voice unbroken by the world beyond the bridge. She looked down at the pendant, then back at him, her breath measured but quickened, her heartbeat rising into her throat. Her hand moved toward his, the skin of her palm cool against the warmth of his glove as she placed it in his keeping. His fingers closed gently around hers, his touch both sure and careful. The wind brushed against them again, a low murmur along the stones, carrying with it the faint rustle of dry reeds from the far bank. He slid the ring onto her finger with deliberate care, the smooth metal finding its place as though it had always been meant for her hand. The band was cool at first, then warmed almost instantly against her skin. His grip lingered for a breath before he released her, his eyes holding hers with quiet intensity. Her gaze fell to the ring, its simple design somehow amplifying the depth of the gesture. She lifted her fingers slightly, the stone catching the pale light before lowering her hand again, her thumb brushing over the band, as if to assure herself it was real. Neither spoke. The moment seemed complete in itself, filled with a clarity that did not require words. The river's current moved on beneath them, its surface a shifting mirror of the muted sky. She could hear the faint rustle of water along the stones of the bridge supports, the sound constant and grounding. His expression softened by a fraction, though the strength in it remained. The wind stilled for an instant, leaving the air between them undisturbed. She felt the weight of the pendant and the ring together, a balance of what had been lost and what had been given, and the quiet understanding that both would remain. Above them, the clouds shifted slightly, allowing a brief glow of light to touch the water below. It caught in the ripples, scattering in soft, fractured patterns that seemed to echo the steady thrum of her pulse. The air was cool, but there was a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the season. She kept her eyes on him, her breath slow and even, aware of every detail. The faint gleam of the silver setting at her throat, the smooth curve of the ring on her hand, the steadiness in his stance. The world beyond the bridge seemed distant, the lane behind them empty, the village quiet. The river flowed on, unhurried, carrying its secrets toward the bend where it would slip from sight. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.